And so I'd like to call you, Andy, to come and have a talk to us. Chris will be in the background.
So, regrettably, I've got to take you away from the high-tech information that you've just received and take you back to the days after the war when flying was quite primitive, relatively speaking. So, I was late home from the war, and the reason for that was that I was one of the few squadrons in England where the Australians owned the aeroplanes. At the end of the war, we were prepared to fly these aircraft which belonged to the Australians back to Australia. And we spent a long time testing and having inoculations and working out our routes and looking forward to landing our Sunderland flying boats on the Swan River. So after some months drifted by, the Australian government said, we can't afford you. The difference in cost between what we paid for the original aeroplanes and the aircraft you're now flying, the modifications would cost so much that it just isn't worth. So we had to take these beautiful new aircraft up to Scotland and sink them, or the Royal Navy sank them. So the fact that I was late home from the war affected the rest of my career enormously, because when I arrived home, I went back to McRoberts and Miller. Now they were the people that employed me before the war as an apprentice engineer. Now, do we have any Jimmy Wood aficionados among me? Because if we do, I must warn you that Jimmy Woods and I are not great friends. I appeared at McRoberts and Miller's to ask for a job. Naturally, I hoped to be flying. And Jimmy Woods at the time was their chief pilot. I'm afraid Jimmy Woods didn't like the idea of this kid that used to sweep out the hangar sitting in his beautiful DC-3s. So he put all sorts of obstacles in my way. It took months to achieve all he wanted me to achieve before he would consider employing me, such as a B license, a navigator's license, a radio officer's license, a 25-word a minute Morse code addition to your radio officer's license. Having achieved all that, he then still said, well, we have no vacant vacancies at the moment, but I will, of course, employ you as soon as we do. I eventually got the message and went across to Australian National Airways. A chap called Ken Steele was the chief pilot of Australian National Airways in Perth, and he employed me instantly. Australian National Airways were flying DC-2s, DC-3s from Perth to Kalgoorlie and then across the Nullarbor, stopping at Forest to refuel, Ceduna, and then down to Parafield. The DC-2, the old Bungana, was one of the aircraft that I flew, and I'm pleased I did, because there weren't very many DC-2s, and there certainly isn't any today. Trouble with the DC-2, it had difficulty braking after landing. The braking system was a lever that came out of the coaming panel, and depending upon which pedal you pressed, you would then get braking on that wheel. So you can imagine the difficulty in landing an aircraft like that in a crosswind, because you had one hand on the control column, one hand on the throttles, and you needed another hand for the brake to come out of it. And then depending on where your feet were, as you pulled this, it would react. So that was my only problem with the DC-2. Now the DC-3 we flew as far as Parafield initially, and then when the original flight time limitations came out, we were restricted to Ceduna. So we had to night stop in Ceduna, and an Adelaide-based crew would come up to Ceduna and slip there. So after a little while in flying those routes, ANA decided that they would like to move me to Adelaide. Now I had just settled down quite comfortably in Perth with my young family, and that was extremely inconvenient. However, having got to Adelaide and started to fly the routes out of Adelaide, they then decided to shift me to Melbourne. And after some months in Melbourne, with my family then staying in Adelaide, life became very difficult. So I went to see the CEO, the CEO, and I said, really that this is not the sort of life I want, and that I've decided to return to the United Kingdom. So Mr. Lucas, his name was very kind and said, if you do not succeed in England, I can assure you we'll be only too pleased to re-employ you when you get back. So having arrived in England with very little money in my pocket, my wife's father gave me a job as a farm labourer, he being a farmer, and during that time I went to work and trying to do the best I could to transfer my Australian licences to British licences. And then I looked around for a job. Now the corporations, I think what a good idea now would be to try and give you some political situation of the life in the United Kingdom at that time. Labour government had decided that they would control the aviation world, and they owned BOAC and BEA. Independent companies were restricted in the type of flying they could do and the type of aircraft they could fly. In other words, they were suppressing any competition that BOAC might receive. Certainly, independent airlines were not allowed to fly any commercial routes. So we had to rely upon things like bucket and spade, taking holiday makers all around the Mediterranean in conjunction with travel companies. We also had to do as much charter work as we could, and wet leasing. I was fortunate to get a job with one of the leading independent airlines called Airwork Limited. It's a rather dull sort of name for an airline that eventually became a very powerful aviation company. To give you an idea of the history of the airline, Airwork Limited were based in Surrey, just outside London, at Blackbush Airport. Their reputation was as a training organisation since World War I. However, after World War II, they decided that they would like to go into the charter business. Now, they had 5 Viking aircraft. Now, the Viking was Britain's answer to the DC-3, and it wasn't much of an answer, really. However, the company took on charter work, and also it managed to convince the government that flying their troops around the world would be cheaper by air than it would by sea. Now you must remember that back in 1949, British troops were stationed all around the world, and to get a trooping contract from the government meant, you know, quite a bit of money, quite a lot of revenue. So this was one of their major considerations. My object when I managed to get a job with Airwork was to try and save some money, because I arrived in England pretty penniless, and therefore I attempted to obtain as many contracts overseas that I could, because that would mean that you earned more money and you had your accommodation paid for. Now the first of these contracts I took was after I'd been given a command in Malta. Now we were based in Malta, and the troops were flown out to Malta, where they were then spread around the Mediterranean. Now we had troops in Tripoli, Libya, Benghazi, El Adam, which was just south of Tobruk, the Canal Zone, and also in Cyprus. So spreading these troops around that area was quite a big job. 2 crews were sent out with our families, and we were there for about a year. During that time, the Suez crisis built up. If you remember, the Egyptians decided that they would nationalize their canal. This did not suit the French, and it certainly didn't suit the British. Consequently, decided that they would kick the Egyptians out of their own canal. Now, to do that, they had to have an enormous number of troops, dropping paratroops on the canal zone, and to do that, we were obviously very heavily employed. But to try and make it look legal, they painted roundels on our aeroplanes and put us in RAF uniform. So we were still based in Malta, but we were virtually RAF pilots. So we continued this of course politically didn't suit the Americans. So if you remember way back in those days, that was the end of Sir Anthony Eden's rule as Prime Minister. The British retired from the canal, or should I say withdrew from the canal, and it became Egyptian property. The other contracts that I managed to have were quite interesting. An oil pipeline, for instance. There was an oil pipeline run from Tripoli, Lebanon, down to Basra and Baghdad. And the idea was that the oil company employed an aircraft to fly the pipeline to see if there are any leaks. Now, you flew at low level, and you followed the pipeline all the way down from Tripoli, Lebanon, to via Kirkuk, Basra, and Baghdad. If there were any leaks, it would show up very quickly on the desert, and therefore they could send out ground staff to repair it, rather than sending out ground staff to drive all the way down the pipeline. Much quicker and easier. So that was one more that we did. After 12 months in Malta, I returned to the UK, and by this time we had opened our first scheduled services. And this was due to a softening of the political situation with Liberal governments. These scheduled services were East and West Africa. Now, they were called safari services, and we were allowed 7 days to fly from London to Nairobi and back again. We were allowed 9 days to fly from London to what was Salisbury and back again. We were allowed 7 days to fly from London to Lagos and Accra and back again, with a day off at our destination. Now, in those days, you must appreciate how primitive life was, particularly in Africa. There were virtually no navigation aids. Consequently, all flying had to be done during daylight hours. No navigation aids at all. So you were literally visually flying, map reading in those days. The route was quite interesting, and the passengers really were quite pleased with the situation. In fact, we were an incredibly popular airline. We carried 21 passengers, and we night stopped at various places on the way through Africa. To give you an idea of what it was, we marked out on the map the various places. We used to night stop. Well, take you on a trip to Nairobi, for instance, we would leave Blackbush Airport in the morning. We would fly leisurely down to Nice, where we would stop for lunch. The 21 passengers would leave the aircraft, and we'd have a very comfortable lunch. Then we'd do another 3.5 hours flying down to Malta, which would be the end of the day's work. We would then park the aircraft, and the passengers and crew would go to the best hotel, and we would spend the evening there. The following morning, at quite a Christian hour, we'd set off again with our 21 passengers that we were getting to know quite well, and we would fly across the Med to a place like El Adam, which was an RAF station just south of Tobruk, and we would refuel there. Then we would cross the Sahara to a place called Wadi Halfa, where we would night stop again with the passengers, and we would go to the hotel, change, shower, meet the passengers in the bar, have a chat, and be in bed by about 10 o'clock. Following morning, we would set off again down through Khartoum and Juba and Entebbe, and finally to Nairobi. So it'd take us 3 days to get there. Then we'd have a day off, and then we'd repeat the whole thing on the way back. And that, from the crew's point of view, was quite enjoyable flying, although it was fairly primitive stuff. If, for instance, you had any problems mechanically, you were pretty much on your own. Communications were poor. Cable and wireless in those days, back in 1949, were about the best you could obtain. And that might take days to get a cable back to London, get instructions from London to do what are you going to do? You don't know. So it was very much up to the captain and the crew to get his passengers back and forth as best he could. to give you an example, when we left Blackbush Airport, the CEO would come out with a great big handful of traveller's checks and say, "Captain, I'd like to see you back in 7 days, if you can manage it." After that, you were very much on your own. To give you an illustration of how you'd sort of fight your way through on a schedule like that, at various stations, or let me put it this way, if you couldn't start your engine, what we're going to do is the starter motor wasn't working. There's no way that you could influence the situation by calling London and having one flown out. You know, that would be almost impossible and certainly very expensive. So there was some equipment that the company made up where you had a leather pouch that fit over the top of the propeller. That was attached to a rubber rope or a bungee rope that was in turn attached to the back of a motor car or a Jeep. The engineer would hold the propeller while the vehicle drove off and the bungee rope gradually, and then he'd let the propeller go and it would spin like hell and the engine would start. That was one of them. If, for instance, your priming pump for your starter wouldn't work, then the engineer would take a cup of petrol, he'd put it on the undercarriage, on the wheel, and then when you were ready to start, you would signal and he would throw this fuel down the air intake as you pressed the button, and the fuel would be dragged into the engine and it would start. And there was very amusing situation there when we were doing this on the way down to Salisbury, as it was then, and the engineer had got it worked out so well that he'd get off the aeroplane, fill up the cup, put it on the undercarriage, on the wheel, and then go about his inspection so it would be there ready for starting. The passengers got off the aircraft and I was walking behind them, behind two lovely old ladies, and as they passed the wheel, one of them said to the other, "Look, my dear, I told you, it's still there." So they were the sort of things we had to put up with. On one occasion, one of our skippers, Piers Wheatley was his name, had to divert from Khartoum to Omdurman, which was a very poor airfield on the other side of the Nile, and he tipped a propeller blade. So he was in deep trouble. He simply said to the engineer, "I'll give you a day to saw off the tips of the prop. Do it properly and we might be able to fly out of here." So that's exactly what he did, and when he started the engine, it didn't even vibrate. So I mean, that was one of the luckiest things he'd ever done. And he flew this thing with reduced propeller blades back to London with a full load of passengers. Due to softening of the political situation, we're allowed to improve our purchase of aircraft, and the company bought its first Viscounts. Now this meant that the old safari service would not be run the way it was. It was much cheaper for the company to slip crews than it was to put passengers in hotels, because the Viscount had a greater range, and it certainly was a lot faster. So the services were maintained, except that we were slipping crews on the West African service at Las Palmas, and since the services were only twice a week, that was wonderful from the crew's point of view. We had a lovely holiday for a few days in Las Palmas waiting for the next aircraft to come through, where we would slip crews and then take it on through Bathurst and Freetown to Lagos and Accra. I must tell you a rather funny story about Accra. I'd never known that the Africans used pidgin English. And I think it was because when the Brits first started, they used to treat the local people like children and used to speak to them like that. Anyway, on this occasion, I had enough time to go into the restaurant at the hotel in Accra to have breakfast before we settled. And I said to the waiter, "I'd like breakfast, please." So he turned to the assembled staff and said, "Chop, chop, quick time, big chief, lorry for up." And I made him repeat it slowly. Chop, chop, breakfast, quick time, in a hurry, big chief, captain, lorry for up, aeroplane. And that's the way they spoke as children. A hostess was a jolly for the chief, for the lorry for up. So every hostess was the captain's jolly. I never found out what a jolly was.
Sure.
Anyway, that was the safari service, which went on for the rest of the company's life, and it was a very enjoyable service for the passengers. Now, the next contract I managed to take was a contract into Berlin, which was very interesting because if you remember, after the airlift in Berlin, the Russians kept the corridors, and they had a corridor to Hanover, Hamburg, and Frankfurt. These corridors were 20 miles wide, 10,000 feet high, and the Russians allowed one airline per country to fly them. So since Berlin was divided into the French, the British, and the Americans, the British were allowed to place 2 aircraft in Berlin and fly these corridors. Now, each airline was the capital airline of the country involved, and as it happened, BEA had a few problems with their vanguards, and they were short of airplanes. So they offered our company the contract for a year or more in Berlin to fly the corridors for them. So this was another opportunity to save some money, and I moved my entire family to Berlin. Now it was like owning your own little airline. You were divorced from the major company. You were controlled entirely from the point of view of its passengers and its administration by British European Airways. So your job was to merely fly the routes on the schedules that they demanded and to keep the aircraft serviceable. That was great. The other thing that was wonderful about Berlin was that the Berliners hadn't got over the tremendous feeling they had towards pilots, having saved them from starvation when the Russians closed all the exits except the air into Berlin. The airlift had only recently been finished and won by the British and the Americans, and of course anyone connected with aviation in Berlin was treated royally. You know, the Berliners were just over the moon. So you can imagine the crews arriving, and the reception we received was really great. We had 2 Viscounts, 4 crews, and an engineering staff. So since I was in charge of the organisation, it was like running my own little airline, which was perfect. So we got the schedules from BEA, and we gave each of the pilots the schedule they'd have to fly. And we said to them, what we'd like you to do is to create a situation where you fly the schedule in a manner where the work is divided evenly, and we'll sit down and have a look at each schedule to see which one would be satisfactory to all of us. So that's what we did, and everyone agreed on a scheduled service and who should do what and when. The engineering staff was similar. We told the engineering staff that all we needed was serviceable airplanes. We wanted engineers to meet us and see us off, and anything else they did was up to them. But had to keep the aircraft serviceable. Now, couldn't have asked for anything better. Everyone settled down. Then it came to the problem of schooling. Now, the number of pilots we had and their families, a lot of them were of school age, and we knew that they would have difficulty in fitting into a German school for just 12 months. So what we decided to do was to create our own school, and we approached the Americans at Tempelhof Airport, and they were very, very helpful. They not only supplied us with a room at the airport, but they gave us desks, and then we advertised locally for instructors, and we found ideal people to instruct the students. We then had all the books sent out from the United Kingdom, and we created our own school. There's a part of the education that you received. So that solved that problem. So in 12 months it was really quite enjoyable. One amusing incident there that I must relate to you is that after a little while we decided that we were getting a little bit competent in speaking German. So we approached the German cabin staff, and they were all German girls, and asked them, would it be possible to talk to the passengers in German? And they said, we don't think there's a problem, except that you must tell us what you're going to say before you say it. So we said, okay, no problem. On this occasion, coming out of Frankfurt, we were climbing up and leveling off, and I pressed the button and called the hostess up and told her what I was going to say. And she said, yeah, this is good. And so therefore I picked up the mic and away I went. Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Wir sind Fliegenmobilitätsmuseum und so weiter. And I actually told them we were getting into Berlin 10 minutes early. Now Then I hung up the mic, all was well. Except I thought that was rather silly. Instead of telling them, I haven't told them why we were getting in there 10 minutes early. Stupidly, I picked up the mic and said directly, Meine Damen und Herren, wir haben ein sehr stark Wind. Now, anyone who speaks German would realize that to say you have a very strong tailwind in German is one of the most disgusting things. And of course, a red-faced hostess arrived saying, Nein, nein, nein! Leaving the door open, I looked back and all the passengers were going. So it just shows you the mistakes you can make. The other occasion was we had to night stop in Frankfurt on this occasion because the airfield was snowed in, and the crew were put on the bus to go into the hotel. I was sitting alongside a quite attractive German hostess, and I thought, well, I'll make conversation. So I said, Fräulein, sind Sie kalt? Are you cold? The reaction was quite startling. She actually coloured up, her eyes flashed, and she said to me, Captain, you've just asked me if I'm frigid. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are in that position, please use the verb to have, not to be. So the correct sentence is haben Sie kalt, not sind Sie kalt. So their ignorance was not bliss, I assure you. Now, except to perhaps show you a few photographs of Tempelhof. It must be the biggest cantilever that's ever been put on an airfield. All the aircraft were inside the cantilever so that the passengers could walk out onto the aircraft without getting wet in those days. But of course the effect when the engine started was the noise was just incredible. This cantilever was a mile long.
0.2 kilometres long.
There we are. Ladies and gentlemen, we're only up to Viscounts. From Viscounts we went to Britannias, then to BC-10s, and then to 747s. So if I have the opportunity of coming back and chatting to you again, then that's what we'll talk about.
Please do.
Yes, please.
Okay, why am I here? They said from the Royal Aeronautical Society. Yeah, I'm the current chairman of the West Australian branch of the Society. What's the Royal Aeronautical Society? Well, it's the world's oldest aeronautical association. In fact, it's been going for 150 years. We celebrated 2 years ago. There's about 20,000 people in the world. They're all over the world. And there's 1,000 in Australia, and there are 6 branches, of which we have 1. So I asked Brian if I could just filter a little of your time to honour this gentleman, who is, to my mind, one of a number of quiet achievers in aviation in this country, indeed through the world. This is the sort of people that we built it on. So that's why I'm here today. It gives me tremendous pleasure to say to Andy, this is your life, Andy, and welcome to the Society of the Fliers. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit down.
This has taken me completely by surprise. It's not deserving at all, I assure you. But it's very wonderful to receive it, and thank you all very much.